Father in heaven, we thank you for the Sabbath day. We thank you for the opportunity that we have to study your word, and I pray that you would guide us through the next hour of this study as we look at the prophecy of Daniel 11. May things be clear, and we pray this in Jesus' name, amen. So, Daniel 11 and the end of the world. Do you think Daniel 11 is important? Just a little bit of background. When you study the prophecy of Daniel 11, this is the last of the four major visions of Daniel. And in Daniel chapter 10, you see this great controversy conflict that is going on where Daniel is fasting and mourning and praying for 3 full weeks. And Gabriel finally talks to him and said that he wrestled with the king of Persia for 3 weeks. And finally, Michael, who is Christ, shows up and turns the heart of the king of Persia so that Gabriel could answer Daniel's prayer and reveal to him what would happen to God's people in the latter days. And it was actually Christ who reveals to Daniel what he sees in the vision of Daniel 11. And it's Gabriel who describes to him verbally, starting in verse 1 of Daniel 11 through verse 4 of chapter 12, what Michael or Christ revealed to Daniel in vision. And we're not going to look at all the verses, but if you look at verses 5 through 8, that's when Daniel sees this vision. In fact, what he sees startles him so much that he's not even sure that he wants to know what it means. And Gabriel then strengthens him to receive the vision and to understand it. Now, that didn't happen to Daniel so much in the other visions. Yes, in Daniel 8, he was astonished, he fainted, he didn't understand the vision. But that's different than seeing the vision and then saying, I'm not even sure if I want to hear the interpretation of it. That's how significant this vision is. And in fact, it was Christ himself who reveals to Daniel this vision. So if Christ appears to Daniel himself and reveals the vision to him, and then in chapter 12, where the explanation is given of a few further things, it's Christ and Gabriel again revealing to Daniel some of the key elements. We have a pretty good idea that Daniel 11 is a very significant vision. And one of the key elements that we see in verse 14 of chapter 10 is when Gabriel says, Now I am come to make you understand what shall befall your people in the latter days, for yet the vision is for many days. So the vision of Daniel 11 has to do with God's people from the time of Daniel down to the end of the world. So it's very important. Now this slide's a little bit busy, and you don't need to look at everything and try to memorize it. It's actually pretty basic. We have the 4 major visions, and you have the kingdoms of this world, and then you have what happens after the kingdoms of this world. In Daniel chapter 2, a stone strikes this image, which represents the second coming of Jesus. That's what Seventh-day Adventists have always understood and believed, and that's what the stone represents, and it becomes a great mountain that fills the whole earth. Christ sets up his kingdom. Daniel chapter 7, after the kingdoms of this world, rather than seeing the second coming of Jesus, we see the Father and the Son moving to the most holy place at the beginning of the judgment in 1844. Daniel chapter 8, we have the kingdoms of this world. Babylon is missing. At the end of the kingdoms of this world, we see that the sanctuary will be cleansed after the 2300 days. And then in Daniel chapter 10, 11, and 12, you have the kingdoms of this world. And at the end of the kingdoms of this world, Michael stands up, which represents the close of probation. Now, I want you to pay attention to the bottom line of all of these visions, because this is what I want you to take away. I'm assuming that you're a good Seventh-day Adventist and you understand the vision of Daniel 2, 7, and 8. And you understand what the gold, the silver, the brass, the iron, the feet of iron, and clay represent. You understand the lion, the bear, the leopard, the dreadful beast, the teeth of iron. I'm not going to go through all of that. You may not understand the king of the north and the king of the south. I'll spend a little bit of time on that as we go through Daniel 11 here. But here's what I want you to focus on from this slide. At the end of each of the 4 major visions, there is a significant event that takes place. The end of Daniel 2, it's the coming of Jesus. So from the very first major prophetic vision, we see that Jesus will come back. But then Daniel 7 shows us that in order for Jesus to come back, there must be a judgment that comes first. Because the kingdoms of this world must be judged. And Daniel 8 shows us that in order for the judgment in heaven to be finished, the sanctuary in heaven must be cleansed. And Daniel 11 shows us that when the sanctuary is cleansed, Michael stands up and probation closes. So get this, Daniel 2, Jesus is coming. Daniel 7, there must be a judgment first. Daniel 8, the sanctuary must be cleansed before the judgment finishes. Daniel 11, when the sanctuary is cleansed, Michael stands up and probation closes. Then Jesus comes back. So these visions are all connected. So if you have some kind of an interpretation of Daniel 11 that is completely disconnected from Daniel 2, 7, and 8, chances are you have a bad interpretation of Daniel 11. Chances are. So when you look at Daniel 11, and when you come to the last few verses of that chapter, if we're saying that when the sanctuary is cleansed, then Michael will stand up and probation will be closed, what do you think the last few verses of Daniel 11 are going to be talking about? I believe that it's going to be talking about the events that take place on this earth that are connected to God's people being cleansed of sin so that the sanctuary in heaven above can be cleansed of sin. Does that make sense? So if you look at the big picture of Daniel, then you can start to fill in the details. But if you try to create the details first and then step back and look at the big picture, there might be a chance that your detail could be off. And so remember, Gabriel tells Daniel, "Now I am come to make you understand what shall befall your people in the latter days, for yet the vision is for many days." I read a statement earlier today, I believe at the Sabbath school this morning, Maranatha 2:49. There must be a cleansing of the sins in the lives of God's people in harmony with Christ's cleansing of the sanctuary in heaven above. So I believe that when we come to the end of Daniel 11 and we're talking about the key elements of the glorious land, the glorious holy mountain, and all of those things, that is going to be directly related to Christ's work of cleansing his people from sin so that Michael can stand up and probation can close. When you see the big picture of Daniel, hopefully that makes sense. So Daniel 2, Jesus is coming again. Daniel 7, in order for Jesus to come back, there must be a judgment first. Daniel 8, in order for the judgment to finish, the sanctuary in heaven must be cleansed. Daniel 11, when the sanctuary in heaven is cleansed, Michael stands up and probation closes. When you see it that way, now Daniel from a big picture standpoint makes sense. And then you see that from the prophetic scope of history, the most important time in the history of this world is between 1844 and the second coming of Jesus. Because that's when Christ goes into the most holy place to begin the judgment, to begin the cleansing of the sanctuary. And between 1844 and the second coming, that's when God's people will make decisions as to whether or not they will be part of that cleansing work. And that's really what Daniel 11 is getting at when we get to the end of that prophecy. So that's what I believe Daniel 11 is about. So now that we've set the table, laid the foundation, let's go through some of the key elements of Daniel 11. And I'll mention, if you look at this far right-hand slide in that column, you will notice that it follows the same pattern as Daniel 8, where you start off with Darius the Mede in verse 1 and then the Persian kings that follow. Now you'll notice that Babylon is missing in Daniel 8 and in Daniel 11. And there's a simple reason why Babylon is missing from those visions. In Daniel chapter 8, you see a ram, a he-goat, and a little horn, which represents Media, Persia, Greece, pagan, and papal Rome. And Daniel asks, the two heavenly beings are speaking to each other in verses 13 and 14 of Daniel 8. And the question is, how long shall be the vision, which in the Hebrew is the word hazon. The hazon refers to what has been seen. And so the question is, how long shall be the vision, or what has been seen? Well, what was seen? A ram, a he-goat, and a little horn. Well, the ram of Media Persia is 539 to 331. The he-goat of Greece is 331 to 168 BC. And the little horn of pagan and papal Rome is 168 BC to 476 AD, and then 538 AD to 1798. That's over a long period of time. So modern scholars who say this has to be Antiochus Epiphanes as the little horn, they don't know what they're talking about, because there's this long period of time. And the 2300-day prophecy starts in the kingdom of Medo-Persia, thus Babylon is missing in Daniel 8. So that's why Babylon is missing. And so Daniel 8 and Daniel 11 specifically are connected to the period of time prophetically from the beginning of the kingdom that will be in existence at the beginning of the 2300 days. And Daniel 8 tells you, and Daniel 9 tells you, the beginning point and what will happen at the beginning point till the coming of Christ with respect to the 2300 days. Daniel 11 gives you the detail of what happens at the end of the 2300 days, after Christ goes into the most holy place. That's what verses 41 to 45 are talking about. Okay, so let's hit some of the highlights of the first few verses. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. You can go back and actually just read Daniel and the Revelation by Uriah Smith. And his description of the first 35 verses are excellent. After 36 to 39, he starts to get confused. But the first 35 verses, he's on target. So Darius the Mede is described in verse 1 of Daniel 11. Then you have Xerxes. And then we move on to Alexander the Great and the division of Greece into the four sections, as we saw in Daniel 7 and 8 as well. You can see on this map the division of Greece into the four empires. Interestingly, we were just at the British Museum on Thursday, and we saw coins of all four of these generals: Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. That was very fascinating to me that history still bears this out, and it's right there in London. So those are the four divisions after Alexander's death. And then you have, from those divisions, Seleucus, you can see, eventually conquers Lysimachus and Cassander. He becomes the king of the north. Ptolemy's down in Egypt. He becomes the king of the south. And it just so happens that God's people in Palestine get caught in the middle between the king of the north and the king of the south. So when you talk about the king of the north and the king of the south, yes, geographically they are the king of the north and the king of the south, but it's especially with respect to God's people who get caught in the middle, and they got caught in the middle between a lot of the battles of the king of the north and the king of the south. So you go through the history, verses 5 through 15, there's many battles between the Seleucid or Antiochus dynasty, which is king of the north, and the Ptolemaic dynasty, the king of the south. And I'll just mention in passing that in verses 7 and 8 and so forth, it talks about Berenice, who was the daughter of Ptolemy, who came to the king of the north to make an agreement. She marries the king of the north. He puts away his wife Laodice, for whom Laodicea was named after. But after 2 years, he gets tired of Berenice, takes Laodice back. She, of course, doesn't trust her husband, so she has him put to death to ensure that her son will become the new king of the north. So now the king of the north and the king of the south blow up at each other again. And that's in verses 6, 7, and 8 especially. It's interesting how that was predicted. We're not putting our focus on there, but I'm just saying if that verse was right on the money, you can guarantee that the verses at the end of the chapter will be as well. You get to verse 16, Pompey defeats Antiochus Asiaticus and becomes king of the north in 65 BC. So now pagan Rome is the king of the north. And Pompey enters into the glorious land. That's in Palestine in 63 BC. Then you have the death of Julius Caesar described in verses 18 and 19, where it says he comes into his own land but stumbles and shall not be found. That's when the Roman Senate murdered Julius Caesar. Then you have Caesar Augustus, the raiser of taxes, in verse 20, which correlates with Luke chapter 2, verse 1. This correlates with the time of Christ. There's a number of other things. I'm not going to get into all of that. You have the final struggle between the king of the north and the king of the south with Caesar Augustus, Mark Antony, and Cleopatra, the Battle of Actium, verses 25 through 28. We don't see the king of the south, which was Egypt, and again until Daniel 11, verse 40. That's just a very, very rapid-fire rundown of the history of the first 30 verses. But you can see the history all the way up until the time of Christ and even beyond that. And actually, in verse 30, which we're going to start talking about here, we see the fall of the Western Roman Empire when it says the ships of Chittim shall come against them. Chittim was in Carthage, which was in North Africa. This was one of the barbaric nations that came against the Western Roman Empire, leading to its downfall in 476 AD. So I believe that if you follow the chronology of Daniel 11, by the time you get to verse 30, you're in 476 AD. Now, Ellen White has a few things to say about Daniel 11. Let's read a couple of her statements. Then we're going to look at the most significant quote that she says. This is Testimonies to Ministers, pages 112 and 113. The light that Daniel received from God was given especially for the last days. The visions he saw by the banks of the Ulai and Hiddekel. So the Ulai is Daniel 8. the Hiddekel is Daniel 10, the great rivers of Shinar are now in process of fulfillment, and all the events foretold will soon come to pass. She gets a little bit more specific. Testimonies, Volume 9, page 14. The world is stirred with a spirit of war. The prophecy of the 11th chapter of Daniel has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. Soon the scenes of trouble spoken of in the prophecies will take place. So she's saying this prophecy has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. So with my prophetic antennas on, I want to know, well, where are we in the prophecy, right? That's very interesting. So let's keep going. Now a very similar statement, but this is actually the most extensive statement that Ellen White makes about Daniel 11. This is her most important statement about Daniel 11 because I believe that it forms a template for us to follow in understanding Daniel 11. Its manuscript release is Volume 13, page 394. So again, if you're following an interpretation of Daniel 11 that does not take into account this statement from Ellen White, chances are you're going to have an interpretation that's off the mark. So notice what she says. We have no time to lose. Troublous times are before us. The world is stirred with a spirit of war. Soon the scenes of trouble spoken of in the prophecies will take place. The prophecy in the 11th of Daniel has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. Now notice what she says next. Much of the history that has taken place in fulfillment of this prophecy will be repeated. Okay, so now I'm saying, okay, which history? If she's saying much of the history that has taken place in fulfillment of this prophecy will be repeated, I want to know which history. Does that not make sense? So now let's keep reading. Then she says, in the 30th verse, a power is spoken of that shall be... Now she starts to quote verse 30. Look in verse 30, and if you go maybe third or fourth line down, you pick it up where it says, shall be grieved. Let's just read it. For the ships of Chittim shall come against them. I believe that's the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD. Now Ellen White's saying there's a power that is spoken of. Who comes after pagan Rome in all of the prophecies of Daniel? Papal Rome. A power is spoken of that shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. So she's speaking of a power, the Bible is speaking of a power that she's pointing us to, that forsakes the holy covenant. This is supposed to be God's church, yet they go against God's covenant, which is his law, and they change the day of rest from Sabbath to Sunday. So here you have a power that is spoken of in the last half of verse 30 that announces the beginning of papal Rome as the new king of the north who takes over and predominates Western Europe starting in 538 AD, roughly. But there's a little bit more to it that we're going to see. Now notice, she keeps quoting Daniel 11, but in the manuscript releases, in order to save paper, they just put in brackets Daniel 11, 31 to 36 quoted. Well, Ellen White quoted them, so let's read them, because this is her only major statement where she really kind of gives us some major ideas about Daniel 11. So let's read verses 31 to 36, because remember, she says, much of the history that has taken place in fulfillment of this prophecy will be repeated. So I want to know which history. She's quoted most of verse 30. Now she's quoting 31 to 36. So let's read this. An arm shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. And they that understand among the people shall instruct many, yet they shall fall by the sword, and by flame, by captivity, and by spoil many days. Now when they shall fall, they shall be holpen with a little help. But many shall cleave to them with flatteries, and some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them and to purge, and to make them white, even till when? To the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. And the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, for that is determined shall be done. So Ellen White's quoted all of that. Notice the very next thing she says in this quote. Scenes similar to those described in these words will take place. So she said much of the history that has taken place in fulfillment of this prophecy will be repeated. So I'm thinking, which history? Well, she tells us, verses 30 to 36. And she says scenes similar to the verses of 30 to 36 described in these words will take place. And the question is, what is the history of 30 to 36? It's the rise of the Roman papacy, the church-state system that predominated over Western Europe and persecuted God's people throughout the Dark Ages until the time of the end in 1798. That is the history of Daniel 11 that's going to be repeated. And then she says a few other things that I'm not going to read. And then she quotes Daniel 12, verses 1 through 4, which if you've studied Daniel 11, you will know that is a direct continuation of Daniel 11, 40 to 45. And when you study Daniel 11, what you'll see is that the unfulfilled portion of Daniel 11 is basically in our day. In her day, it was actually the last half of verse 40 through the end of the chapter. In our day, it's basically 41 to 45 and 12, 1 to 4. So the unfulfilled portion of Daniel 11, I believe Ellen White is suggesting, is going to follow a very similar pattern to Daniel 11, 30 to 36. Does that make sense? And we're going to see the pattern of Daniel 11, 30 to 36 now. So here's the key elements. They have intelligence with them that forsake the Holy Covenant. So papal Rome forms a political alliance with the kings of the earth. And they abandon the law of God. They go against the Sabbath. Verse 31, arms shall stand on his part. And you have to understand some history here, but this is the school of the prophets. So we're in the school of the prophets. This is a bit of a didactic session. This is something that you need to understand. Arms shall stand on his part. Listen, the papacy has never had its own military. They've always relied as a church system on the state power that they've made alliance with to give them military assistance. And in 508, Clovis, the king of the Franks, which is modern-day France, made an agreement with papal Rome, and he prayed to, his wife was Catholic, and he prayed to his wife's God that if he would gain a victory in this important battle, that he would become a Catholic, and that's what happened. And so he lent his power to the Roman church state, and this was the time when, after the fall of the pagan Western Roman Empire, there was strife in Western Europe over who would become the supreme power, and it was through the assistance of Clovis and the Franks that the papacy then became the preeminent power in Western Europe, and through that alliance with the military, the three horns are plucked up by the roots as described in Daniel 7, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, and the Heruli. But the papacy didn't have its own power to do so. It needed military power. So we see that in verse 31, and that's 508. In 533, Justinian declares the Roman bishop to be the head of all churches. That decree was made effective in 538 when Belisarius drove out the Ostrogoths from Rome. To take away the daily, paganism is removed by papal Rome in 508. The abomination of desolation is the union of church and state that takes place in 508 and 538 with the state giving its military power to assist the papacy, and then in 538 with the decree of Justinian that makes the Roman bishop the head over all the churches and over the state as well. So these are some key elements in verse 31. We keep moving. We see the persecution of the saints in verse 33. Once a corrupt church unites with a state, persecution of God's true saints always follows. And we see that they were persecuted by the sword, by flame, by captivity, and by spoil. By the sword, that's pretty obvious. They were put to death with a sword, burned at the stake, put into prison. And spoil means this. You probably know what this means, but spoil means that the Catholics were promised by the church that if they were to capture and to put to death heretics or non-Catholics, not only would they gain their property, but they would gain eternal life. So the spoil was the spoil, the property of Protestants or those who didn't follow the Catholic Church when their property was taken over by Catholics. And then the many days, as seen in verse 33, is the 1260 years. That correlates with Daniel 7:25, where the little horn power wears out the saints for a time, times and a half a time. The persecution continues until the time of the end. In verse 35, this is clearly speaking of 1798. Now, interestingly, and I don't have this in my slide, but if you're a sharp student of Bible prophecy, you'll notice that Ellen White quotes through verse 36. Now, if you're a student of Daniel 11, that's important because Uriah Smith switches the king of the north in verse 36 to France. Ellen White doesn't. Ellen White keeps it the same power as the papacy. So there's some modern literalists who still keep Daniel 11 the way Uriah Smith interprets it, and they're trying to tell us that the events that have happened in Turkey recently are a fulfillment of Daniel 11, and I'm like, yeah, I don't see that. But there's some other interpretations as well that are out there that I'll mention later. But verses 36 and onward are still describing the papacy as the king. He speaks marvelous things against the God of gods. This is very similar to the language that Paul uses in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 to describe the man of sin. And there's a few other things. You can see the celibacy of the priest, where it says he shall not regard or will not have the desire of women. There's a few other things in there that are interesting. But continuing on through this template, the deadly wound is seen in verse 40, which is 1798. So we have a template that we can follow. Ellen White says much of the history that has taken place in fulfillment of this prophecy will be repeated. Now, sometimes when we think of Daniel 11, we're thinking, oh, this is so complicated. But hopefully what I've just shown you is history that you're familiar with. You're familiar with the fact that the papacy replaced pagan Rome as the next major kingdom in the prophecies of Daniel, that it made an alliance of church and state, that it persecuted the saints, that it ruled for 1,260 years. And Ellen White's saying much of the history that has taken place will be repeated. Now notice it's not the same thing, but it's similar. And she says seen similar. So sometimes people will try to make it a point-by-point identical repetition. Ellen White is saying it's not identical, but it's similar. There's a pattern that we can follow. Seen similar to those described in these words. I mean, I've seen some prophecy charts that are so precisely detailed, and then when it doesn't happen exactly the way they've predicted it, then people get discouraged. Well, that's because you're making it too precise. Ellen White says seen similar. It's not identical. There is a difference between identical and similar the last time I checked in the dictionary. So seen similar to those described in these words will take place. So in other words, there's not going to be 1,260 years, or we're not going to change that into 1,260 literal days, for example, because there's no more time prophecy after 1844. But there is going to be, in the future, the rise again of the papacy. It's going to make a comeback. The deadly wound is going to be healed. We understand that from Revelation 13. And when the deadly wound is healed, church and state will unite. We understand that from Revelation 13. And when church and state unite, God's people will be persecuted. We understand that again. That's not unique to Daniel 11. But when we understand that there's a template that we can follow, then the end of Daniel 11 starts to make more sense. So church and state will unite. The saints will be persecuted. But just as the papacy received a deadly wound, it will also come to its end again. So we see that a military force of state will support the king of the north. There will be a church-state union, which is the abomination of desolation. The saints will be persecuted, but the king of the north will come to its final end. Now, what we need to talk about as well to help us understand how the papacy will make a comeback, because eventually after verses 30 through 39, verse 40 says, "And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him," which is the king of the north. Now, I've heard some interesting interpretations on verse 40 as well. If the interpretation that you are hearing about verse 40 does not connect this to the deadly wound of 1798, that is an interpretation that falls outside of the historicist understanding of Adventism. It says, at the time of the end. And as Seventh-day Adventists, when do we understand the time of the end to begin? 1798. Now, if you haven't ever seen how to prove this before, just briefly, here in Daniel 11 it says that the persecution of the saints would continue until the time of the end. in verse 35. It said it would be for many days in verse 33. So it's for many days, which is the 1260 days. It's until the time of the end in verse 35. And Daniel 7:25 says that the little horn would wear out the saints for a time, times in the dividing of time, which is 1260 years. So that's the 1260 years of persecution from 538, when the decree of Justinian goes into effect, until 1798, which we're going to talk about here. That's the deadly wound. That's the rule of the papacy. And it's at the time of the end that the king of the south pushes at the king of the north. That is the deadly wound in verse 40. That is a key prophetic road mark in this prophecy. At the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. The word push in the Hebrew is the Hebrew word nagak, which means to gore. It's like a bull with a horn that takes its bull and gores into something with the intent to kill. This is the deadly wound. So we understand from history that in 1798, Napoleon sent his general Berthier into the Vatican to take Pope Pius VI captive in response to the murder of the guy who was supposed to be the brother-in-law of Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte. Shortly before the wedding took place, there was a demonstration in Rome, and the Vatican Papal Guard shot to death Joseph Bonaparte, the brother of Napoleon's soon-to-be brother-in-law, and that caused a reaction from France. Interestingly, there had been a peace treaty between the papacy and France in 1798, so the deadly wound really wasn't supposed to happen until this unrest took place at the end of 1797. And then in 1798, Berthier comes into the Vatican, into Rome, takes Pius VI captive, and at that point, the papacy lost its control over the state power. That was the deadly wound. And that's what verse 40 is talking about. So the king of the south pushes at the king of the north. Now the king of the south was always Egypt in the first 30 verses. So how is France the king of the south now? You go to Revelation chapter 11, you see this beast coming up out of the bottomless pit, which is describing the French Revolution. Spiritually in Revelation verse 8, it's described as Sodom and Egypt. Interestingly, this is at the end of the 1260 years. It was France that gave its military to assist the papacy at the beginning of what's called the 1290 years in 508. And it was always France that was the most supportive of the papacy. It was from France that you had St. Bartholomew's Massacre. The Protestants were driven out of France. They were the most supportive of France throughout the years. And so the French developed a view of God that he was a mean, vengeful tyrant, and they didn't want to have anything to do with God. So at the end of the 1260 years, they say, let's get rid of God. Let's form an atheistic society. Let's worship the goddess of reason. And what you ended up getting is the reign of terror, anarchy, a godless society. And what France showed at the end of the 1260 years is what Satan's government in heaven would have been like if he had gained control of heaven. Interestingly, Christ's ministry was for 3.5 literal years, and at the end of the 3.5 years, he dies. He suffers a deadly wound. But then he has a resurrection. The papacy, who the dragon or Satan gave his power, seat, and authority to, rules for 3.5 prophetic years, and at the end of those 3.5 prophetic years, they receive a deadly wound. But then they're going to have a resurrection as well. They are the Antichrist. But the French Revolution shows the principles of Satan's government. So we see that here in Daniel 11, verse 40. Atheism of Egypt is reborn in France. Ellen White refers to the atheism of Pharaoh, who is Jehovah, that I should obey him. After France, the king of the south continued as communist Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. In 1844, Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto from Paris, France, in 1844. Very interesting. But there's going to be a comeback of the king of the north. Now remember, Ellen White says much of the history that has taken place in fulfillment of this prophecy will be repeated. She says scenes similar to those described in these words, which was the 1260 or 1290 years of papal supremacy, depending on if you're starting from 508 or 538. There's the 1260 and the 1290. So that's the history that's going to be repeated. So how does the king of the north make a comeback? The last half of verse 40 says, "And the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships." What does that sound like? That sounds like an army. What was the first thing that the papacy did in verse 31? What does it say of the king of the north in verse 31? It says, "And arms shall stand on his part." Here in the last half of verse 40, the king of the north, the papacy, is making a comeback again with the very same mechanism. It needs an outside entity to use its military to back up its ideology. History is repeating itself. And I'm not going to go through all that. It's pretty obvious that chariots and horsemen are military power. History repeats. Arms shall stand on his part. So there's military power. Then we saw that there was the abomination of desolation and then the persecution of the saints. So we should see a very similar pattern develop as we go through Daniel 11 here. So the king of the north receives a deadly wound. What's the next event? Military power gives force to the papacy to come back against the king of the south. Have we seen any nation form an alliance with papal Rome since 1798 to lead to at least a pushback, if not the downfall, of the atheistic king of the south? Now, mind you, I'm not ready to say that the king of the south is completely gone, because I live in the United States, and you live here in the UK. And in the United States, and you're seeing it over here also, we just had the Supreme Court a year ago legalize gay marriage in the United States. That's the king of the south still rearing its ugly head. So the king of the south isn't completely gone yet. But there's been some major events to weaken the king of the south in the meantime. February 24, 1992, Time magazine wrote an article by Carl Bernstein entitled "The Holy Alliance," describing the first meeting between President Reagan and Pope John Paul II on June 7, 1982, where they met for 50 minutes, nearly an hour. And they talked in this meeting of how they would work together with Lech Walesa in Poland through the Solidarity movement, where Catholic Europe would unite with Protestant America to lead to the downfall of atheistic Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. It was one of the great secret alliances of all time, as said in this article. And on June 12, 1987, President Reagan, in an iconic moment of his presidency, is probably what he's best remembered for, stood in front of the Berlin Wall at the Brandenburg Gate and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And 2 years later, the Berlin Wall came tumbling down. Friends, that was not just an interesting piece of history. That's prophetic history happening before our very eyes. That the king of the south made a push and gave a deadly wound in 1798. But now the king of the north is making a comeback, because here it has in its own backyard of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, you have the Russian Orthodox Church and you have atheistic Eastern Europe. It can't even make inroads into its backyard. But after the Berlin Wall falls, not only did Protestants rush into that territory, so did the Catholic Church. Where are we today? What's happening now? Again, this quote, "We have no time to lose. Troublous times are before us. The world is stirred with the spirit of war. Soon the scenes of trouble spoken of in the prophecies will take place." The prophecy in the 11th of Daniel has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. Much of the history that has taken place in fulfillment of this prophecy will be repeated. Scenes similar to verses 30 to 36 described in these words will take place. So you have a military power, namely France, that props up the papacy in 508. I believe that in the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan used his power as President of the United States for America to begin to form an alliance with the papacy, so that the papacy knows that it has the backing of the military power of the United States to enforce its vision for this world. Now, that has not yet fully come to fruition, and that will not fully come to fruition until there is a Sunday law. But the seeds and the foundation were very clearly laid so that the papacy and the United States came together to lead to the downfall of the Soviet Union and to communism and to the fall of the Berlin Wall. That was a very significant event. Continuing. So what's the next thing that happens? So it says, he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. You could make a case that the countries that were entered into would have been the Soviet Union and the Eastern European nations that formed the bulk of the nations of the King of the South. But we still have China to deal with. So I'm not ready yet to say that it's fully fulfilled. I think that there's still some things that need to take place. Now, so we've seen the military power being repeated. The next thing that needs to happen is a church-state union formed. Because in verse 31, after arms stands on his part and they take away the daily, which I'm not going to get into that, it says, they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. The abomination of desolation, which is the union of church and state, which leads to the persecution of the saints. So there is going to be something that happens next in the prophecy of Daniel 11 that is going to be related to the union of church and state, which will lead to the persecution of the saints, and that has to be referring to a national Sunday law. So how does that happen? These are the things that are going to come. We'll look at these. Verse 41 says, he shall enter also into the glorious land, and many, now the word countries is supplied, so it really should read, and many shall be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. Now I know sometimes it's a bit of a hot topic about who the glorious, or what the glorious land is, what's the glorious holy mountain. The way that I make my case on the glorious land is to discuss the glorious holy mountain first. Now, for those of you who have never studied Daniel 11 before, let me just make this pretty simple. This is not hard. It's not rocket science. Just pay attention closely to what I say, though. The glorious land in verse 16 of Daniel 11 was describing Palestine or Judea, which was the territory of God's people at that time. Now, the glorious holy mountain is describing Mount Zion in Jerusalem, which is on the north side of Jerusalem. Let me just give you a few verses to help you understand what the glorious holy mountain is. If you go to Daniel 9, verse 16, Daniel's making this prayer, and he's saying, O Lord, according to all thy righteousness, I beseech thee, let thine anger and thy fury be turned away from thy city Jerusalem, thy holy mountain. So if you just stick to the book of Daniel, Jerusalem is described as the holy mountain. But there's a few other verses. You go to Psalms 48, verses 1 and 2, where we read, Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised in the city of our God and the mountain of his holiness, beautiful for situation. The joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion on the sides of the north, the city of the great king. Mount Zion's on the north side of Jerusalem. Psalms 2, verse 6 says, Yet have I set upon my hill, my king upon my holy hill of Zion. Go to Joel 2, verse 32. Go to Joel 2, verse 32. And I believe this gives us some further clarity about the glorious holy mountain, which is a smaller territory within the glorious land. Joel 2:32 says, And it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be delivered. Remember Daniel 12, verse 1, where it says, And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince, which standeth for the children of thy people. And then at the end of the verse it says, And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. Here we see in Joel 2:32, right after it describes the sun being dark and the moon to blood, the great day and terrible day of the Lord. Then it says, And it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be delivered. For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem shall be deliverance, as the Lord hath said, and in the remnant whom the Lord shall call. I believe that the glorious holy mountain is describing God's end-time remnant church. But there's the glorious land, which is a greater territory of the glorious holy mountain. And the glorious holy mountain is only described at the very end, just before probation closes, after the loud cry has been given. So the glorious land is earlier in the sequence of this prophecy. Here's what I believe, and I'm going to prove it as I go here. I believe that the glorious holy mountain describes the remnant who will be the 144,000 who survive the shaking of the end-time crisis. I believe that the glorious land represents worldwide Adventism prior to the shaking. And when the king of the north enters into the glorious land, he is entering into that territory for the purpose of conquest. Whenever the king of the north or the south enters into a territory in Daniel 11, it is for the purpose of conquest. And the king of the north enters into the territory of God's people for the purpose of conquest. And the way he can conquer God's people is through the national Sunday law. Because that is how God's people will receive the mark of the beast. And if you receive the mark of the beast, you are now under the dominion of the king of the north. Does that make sense? The glorious land is the territory of God's people prior to the shaking. And when the king of the north enters into the glorious land, it says, many shall be overthrown. So the glorious land and the glorious holy mountain cannot be the same thing. The illustration I use, because I gave this talk one time in Baltimore, Maryland, is that Baltimore, Maryland is one city in the United States of America. So if you're in Baltimore, you are in the United States, but you could be anywhere else in the United States, but not necessarily be in Baltimore. So if you're in the glorious holy mountain, you are in the glorious land. But if you're in the glorious land, you're not necessarily in the glorious holy mountain. Just a minor point. So I believe that the glorious holy mountain describes those who survive the shaking. They are spiritual Mount Zion who will stand with the Lamb. Revelation 14, the glorious land is worldwide Adventism before the shaking. And so when the king of the north enters into the glorious land, this is the national Sunday law. This is the abomination of desolation. This is history repeating itself. Just as military power props up the papacy in Daniel 11:30 to 36, we see it happening again in 40 to 45. That then leads to a union of church and state, an abomination of desolation. And we see history repeating itself, just as Ellen White said that it would. Ellen White says, speaking of those who will be overthrown, as the storm approaches, a large class who have professed faith in the third angel's message, but who have not been sanctified through obedience to the truth, abandon their position and join the ranks of the opposition. By uniting with the world and partaking of its spirit, they have come to view matters in nearly the same light. And when the test is brought, they are prepared to choose the easy popular side. Men of talent and pleasing address who once rejoiced in the truth employ their powers to deceive and mislead souls. Let me say something else to you. Notice how it says, those who have not been sanctified through obedience to the truth. If you don't believe that you need to be sanctified, you're being prepared to receive the mark of the beast. Just keep that in mind. If your gospel leaves sanctification out of the gospel, you're being prepared to receive the mark of the beast. There's 4 stages to the Sunday law. So the first stage is the king of the north entering into the glorious land, and it's going to progress. The first stage is just, let's have a rest day for family, for society, for energy, for environment, whatever you want to call it. We're going to cut back on Sunday work. And so we'll see various stages of the Sunday law as it progresses, and nobody will necessarily be able to argue with, well, that's not a bad idea. We can conserve the environment, save on energy, have a family day. That sounds all nice and great. Then it becomes you need to honor Sunday, but you can still worship on the Sabbath as well. Then it becomes no, you can't worship on Sabbath, only on Sunday. Fines and imprisonment will be imposed. And finally, when we get to the end, and this is down in verses 44, 45, a death penalty will be inflicted upon those who worship on Sabbath and disregard Sunday. So those are the 4 stages of the Sunday law, which you can see through Daniel 11. Now, just a few points as we go through Daniel 11, and we have maybe 10, 15 minutes, and we'll wrap this up. Who's Edom, Moab, and Ammon? So Edom, of course, the Edomites are the descendants of Esau. Moab and Ammon are the descendants of the sons of Lot through his daughters, so not the greatest story. But they were related to God's people. And if you go to Isaiah 11, this is very easy to remember. When you go to Isaiah chapter 11, in verse 11, it says, it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people. Now, just in the verse prior to that, it said there would be a root of Jesse which will stand for an ensign of the people. That's the Sabbath. And you go down through, this is describing God's remnant at the end of time. And in verse 14, at the last half of this verse, it says that Edom and Moab and the children of Ammon shall obey them. So while many Seventh-day Adventists are overthrown during the Sunday law crisis, the Edomites, Moabites, and Ammonites come in. They are related to God's true church, but they aren't God's true church. I believe these are people in the other churches who are not Seventh-day Adventists, but they believe to be following God. And when they see the true light at the end of time, they come in during the final crisis. And Isaiah 11, I think, bears that out. So that's Edom, Moab, and Ammon. Now then we see, he shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. The land of Egypt is the territory of the king of the south. There are still atheistic nations today, like China, Laos, Vietnam, Cuba. Those nations are going to drop very quickly, because remember, if you correlate to Revelation 13, you see Protestant America, which is the false prophet, is making fire come down from heaven on the earth on the side of men, meaning that he is working supernatural miracles to promote false worship. And at that point, there won't be any atheists left, because the motto of atheism is seeing is believing, basically. And when they see these supernatural miracles, they're going to believe what they see. So when the papacy stretches forth his hand upon the countries, and the land of Egypt does not escape, the remaining atheistic nations of this world will fall. Verse 43, but he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. So he's going to gain control over the financial interests of the entire world, including the territory of the king of the south. And I believe this correlates with no man being able to buy or sell in Revelation 13. And then it says, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. If you study the history of Daniel 11, you go back to the last battle between the king of the north and the king of the south, the battle of Actium, when Caesar Augustus is the king of the north, Mark Antony and Cleopatra are the king of the south, representing Egypt. It was the Libyans and the Ethiopians who formed a last line of defense for the king of the south before they fell to Rome. And I believe that the Libyans and the Ethiopians spiritually here represent a last line of geopolitical defense, so to speak, for the atheistic nations of the world. Now, if you look at the last 30, 50, 60 years, it's been the Islamic nations of the Middle East who formed a political alliance with the atheistic nations of this world. Now, some people try to make Islam into a bigger deal prophetically than they really are. And I hear some people out there saying that they represent the king of the south, but then they aren't connecting that to 1798. And they're saying that we're waiting for Islam to attack the papacy, and that will be the final event sign before Jesus comes back. But that's not true to historicism. And furthermore, Islam is not a major player of any of the other prophecies. So why would it suddenly become a major player in Daniel chapter 11? I see Islam as a minor ancillary player. Libya and Ethiopia, they've been a last line of defense for the atheistic nations of the world, but they're going to fall into line with the papacy as well as the final crisis unfolds. The Libyans and the Ethiopians will be at the steps. Now here's the thing, when you look at the map, the king of the north, he's conquered all the territory to the north. He then comes through the territory of God's people, and he's seemingly conquered the territory of God's people because he enters into the glorious land, and it says, many shall be overthrown. So it seems like God's people drop quickly to the Sunday law. It's like, oh, wow, all the world is wandering after the beast. Now he's down into Egypt, Libya, and Ethiopia. And in the Hebrew mind in this time, if you've come down through the territory of God's people into Egypt, and now Libya and Ethiopia at your steps, you've conquered the whole world. And seemingly all the world wonders after the beast, but that is not the end of the story of this prophecy. But tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly to make away many. If you look at the map, to the north and to the east of Egypt is the glorious holy mountain, which is where the remnant is found. And they are the ones who are giving the loud cry message, the tidings out of the east and out of the north. And that loud cry message is Babylon the Great, the king of the north, the Roman church state, papal system is fallen, and has become the habitation of devils and the hold of every foul spirit. And when the king of the north hears this, he goes forth with great fury to destroy and utterly to make away many, which correlates with Revelation 12:17 when it says the dragon was wroth with the woman, the one who's giving the loud cry message, the remnant church. He is wroth with a woman and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Is it no coincidence that in God's last day church, obedience and the testimony of Jesus, which is the spirit of prophecy, are under the greatest attack in God's church? Because those are the identifying marks that will help to preserve us as we stay connected to Jesus from the final attacks of Satan. And then verse 45, and he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. Now the King James says, in the glorious holy mountain. The New King James correctly translates that it's between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. So the tabernacles of the palace is between the Mediterranean Sea and Jerusalem on the old map, but this is in spiritual terms. Now, the loud cry message, I'll just mention this. It's the message of Christ's righteousness. It's going to lighten the earth with God's glory. It proclaims that Babylon has fallen. So we see history repeating itself. And when this loud cry message is given, now not only do we have a military power propping up the papacy with the United States, we now have union of church and state, national Sunday law. Now we see the persecution of the saints when they give the loud cry message. Persecution revives. Then he plants the tabernacles of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. You can kind of see the Mediterranean Sea off to the left on this map. Jerusalem is in the really bright green spot on the map there in the center. And you look at this map, you see the Vatican on the top. That's the Palace of Versailles on the bottom. This just gives you an idea that a tabernacle is a place of worship. And a palace is a place where a king resides. This is the final abomination, the final union of church and state between the seas. Sea in Bible prophecy, Revelation 17:15, represents people. So all the world is wondering after the king of the north, and he has all the world backing up his final union of church and state, which is a Sunday law attached to a death decree. And then the glorious holy mountain is this small spot on the map, which, as we saw in Joel 2:32, represents Mount Zion or Jerusalem or the remnant where God's people will be delivered. And seemingly, you're going to have this whole ocean of people, this whole sea of people who's backing up the papacy and its false church-state system. Seemingly, they're going to wipe God's remnant church off the map. And it seems that all is lost to the cause of God, to the human eye. But that's when Daniel chapter 12, verse 1 takes place, when it says, and at that time, when the king of the north has all the world following after it, and when he makes a death decree against God's people, it is at that time that Michael stands up for his people. And then there's the time of trouble. And then it says, and at that time shall thy people be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. If you read this quote from Review and Herald, November 19, 1908, Ellen White talks about Michael standing up around the time of trouble. Close of probation. I want to mention something very interesting here. Michael is described 4 times in Scripture. He's described the first time chronologically in the history of the universe in Revelation chapter 12, verse 7, where it says, and there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon and his angels and prevailed not, neither was their place found any more in heaven. Michael represents Christ, and he's in cosmic conflict with the devil, and the devil is cast out in chapter 12 of Revelation. The next place that we see chronologically with respect to the history of the universe is in the book of Jude, verse 9, where it says, yet Michael the archangel, when contending with the devil, he disputed about the body of Moses, durst not bring against him a railing accusation, but said, the Lord rebuke thee. This time Christ is going to raise Moses from the dead, and Satan saying, he's my property, I got him to sin, you can't raise him from the dead. And Michael prevails over Satan and raises up Moses from the dead. The next time we see Michael chronologically is in Daniel chapter 10, at the beginning of this prophecy, where Gabriel contends over the mind of Cyrus for 3 weeks, and Satan is standing there pushing back as hard as he can, because he understands that if Cyrus allows for the prophecies to go forward with respect to the Jews, that the Messiah will come and that the cleansing of the sanctuary will come. So Daniel prays for 3 weeks, and because of his faithful prayers, Michael comes and he prevails, and the prophecy is given. And so then the prophecy is given, and we go down the scope of history, and we come down to the very end of time. And this represents the last struggle between Michael or Christ and Satan. Every time Michael is described, it describes cosmic conflict between Christ and Satan. And the final conflict comes when the dragon or Satan, who gives his power, seat, and authority to the papacy, the king of the north, they are about to put God's people to death. And it's at that time that Michael stands up, and there's a reason why he stands up, because he is standing up from being seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Very briefly, he is described as our high priest in Hebrews 8, verses 1 and 2. Hebrews 8:1 says, "Now the things which we have spoken, this is the sum. We have such an high priest who is set on the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched and not man." So what's Jesus doing while he's seated at the right hand of God? He is our high priest. And Hebrews 8:6 says he is the mediator of a better covenant. And he is working, in Hebrews 8:9-12, to write his law into our hearts and minds. When he finishes his work as our high priest, he will have a commandment-keeping people. Not only that, he is described in Hebrews 12, verses 1 and 2, as the author and the finisher of our faith. We talked about this last night. It says he endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. So not only is he our high priest, he is the author and the finisher of our faith, helping us to run with patience the race that is set before us. He is helping us to exercise faith, the faith of Jesus. So when Christ finishes his work as our author and finisher of our faith, not only is he our high priest helping us to keep his law, he is helping us to have patience and the faith of Jesus. So here's the thing. Before I read this quote, when Michael stands up, he has finished the most important work in the great controversy. He has finished his work that he was doing while seated at the right hand of God. He's our high priest, working to write his law into our hearts and minds. He's the author and the finisher of our faith, helping us to develop patience and to have the faith of Jesus. That's Revelation 14:12. Here is the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. And when Satan sets a death decree against God's people, they are sealed. Probation is closed. And Michael stands up and he looks to the onlooking universe and he says, "Do you have any questions now?" Here they are. Here is the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. They are the demonstration to the universe that Michael, or Christ, has prevailed against Satan in the great controversy. And the last verses of Daniel 11 show us that the sanctuary in heaven has been cleansed of sin, and Christ now has his people who are ready to go through the great time of trouble, who will be his demonstration of what God can do among the most wicked and perverse generation who has ever lived. Yet God will take from that generation people who he will recreate into his image. And so, early writings 2:54, the third angel closes his message thus: "Here is the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus." And the third angel's message, this is 8T 197, embracing the messages of the first and second angel's messages, is the message for this time. We are to raise aloft the banner on which is inscribed the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. Friends, this is the prophecy of Daniel 11. It's pointing to what's going to happen to God's people at the end of the world. But then, verse 45 says that the papacy will come to his end and none will help him. He is going to be destroyed, and Christ is going to deliver his people. If we choose to stay with Christ, we will be on the right side. We will be on the winning side. And the very next major thing I believe that's going to happen in this prophecy is that the King of the North is going to enter into the glorious land. This is the Sunday law. I don't know when it's going to happen. These are event prophecies. But once he enters into the glorious land, the final movements will be rapid ones. It's going to go very, very quickly. But Daniel 11 shows us what's going to happen. It's a very fascinating prophecy, and it shows us where we are in the scope of Earth's history. Things are happening quickly. Now is the time to hold on to Jesus more than you ever have before, to be ready for his soon coming. Amen? Amen. So that's our presentation on Daniel 11. And I think we're going to have some time for questions and answers after the last presentation. Pastor Ramden's going to talk about that. But let's close right now with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you that in our school of the prophets we've been able to spend some time gaining a deeper understanding of this prophecy of Daniel 11, understanding the key prophetic waymarks of when the time of the end starts and what happens after that, and of our role in the great controversy and of who we are with respect to the glorious land and to the glorious holy mountain. May we be found among those who are delivered when Michael stands up. May we allow you to help us to develop patience. May you write your law into our hearts and minds. May we look to you and develop the faith that we need to be ready for Jesus to come. Thank you for these prophecies that show us where we are in the scope of Earth's history. May we be faithful and ready when Jesus comes, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen.